Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that'll ease you into sleep while feeding your curiosity. The brutal, bone-chilling reality of how medieval soldiers survived winters that could kill a man in hours. Before smartphones, before central heating, before any of the comforts we take for granted, these warriors faced months of frozen hell armed with nothing but wool, ingenuity, and sheer stubborn will to live. So grab your favourite blanket, dim the lights, maybe let that soft hum of your heater remind you just how good you have it, and let's journey back to a time when winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a season-long battle for survival. Picture this, you're a foot soldier in the army of Edward I, and it's December 1296. The Scottish campaign has dragged on longer than anyone expected, and now you're camped somewhere near the frozen banks of a river whose name you can't even pronounce. The ground beneath your feet isn't just cold, it's stone hard, frozen solid for months. Your breath comes out in thick white clouds that hang in the air like ghostly reminders of how close you are to becoming one yourself. This isn't the romantic medieval warfare you see in movies. There are no warm castles to retreat to, no roaring fireplaces, no hearty feasts. Just you, thousands of other miserable souls, and a winter that seems determined to claim more lives than any enemy sword ever could. Medieval armies didn't have the luxury of avoiding winter campaigns. Wars didn't pause for weather, and neither did the soldiers who fought them. From the 100 Years' War to the Crusades, from Viking raids to the conquests of Charlemagne, medieval warfare was a year-round occupation. And winter was just another enemy to defeat, though often a deadlier one than any human foe. The statistics tell a chilling story. More medieval soldiers died from exposure, disease, and winter-related hardships than ever fell to enemy weapons. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, pneumonia filled makeshift hospitals, starvation weakened entire armies until they could barely hold their weapons, let alone swing them. But here's what's remarkable. Despite facing conditions that would challenge modern survival experts equipped with the latest gear, these medieval warriors developed an intricate system of winter survival tactics. They learned to read weather patterns like ancient meteorologists, to construct shelters that could withstand howling blizzards, and to find warmth and sustenance in the most unlikely places. They mastered the art of staying alive when everything around them was trying to kill them. Let's start with the most basic challenge: shelter. When you're on campaign, you don't get to pick your campsite based on scenic views or convenient amenities. You stop where your commanders tell you to stop, often in the middle of nowhere, on ground that's either muddy swamp or frozen wasteland. The lucky soldiers, those with some rank or experience, might have access to a proper tent, but we're not talking about modern camping gear here. Medieval military tents were heavy canvas affairs, if you were fortunate enough to have canvas at all. More often, they were made from wool or linen, materials that could keep out some wind, but turned into soggy, frozen nightmares when the weather turned nasty. The average foot soldier, the backbone of any medieval army, often had nothing more than a simple lean-to made from whatever materials they could scavenge. Branches, animal hides, stolen fence posts, anything that could be arranged into something resembling shelter. These weren't the neat, organised camps you might imagine. They were chaotic collections of improvised structures, each one a testament to human creativity under pressure. But the real genius came in the details. Medieval soldiers learned that digging was often more important than building. They would excavate shallow pits, just deep enough to get their bodies below ground level, where the earth provided some insulation from the wind. These dugouts weren't comfortable, but they were warmer than sleeping on the surface. Snow, when available, became a building material. Packed snow walls could block wind and actually provide insulation. Veterans knew to leave small gaps for ventilation, understanding instinctively what modern science has proven, that completely sealed shelters could become death traps filled with toxic air. The positioning of these shelters was crucial. Experienced soldiers always looked for natural windbreaks. A cluster of trees, a hillside, even large rocks could mean the difference between a miserable night and a fatal one. They learned to read the landscape like a book, identifying spots where cold air would pool and areas where it would flow past. They discovered that sleeping on slopes, even gentle ones, kept them out of the coldest air that settled in valleys during the night. Inside these crude shelters, the challenge became staying warm without burning down their temporary homes. Fire was both salvation and threat. Too little heat and you'd freeze. Too much and you'd either suffocate from smoke or watch your shelter go up in flames. Medieval soldiers became masters of the small, controlled fire. They learned to build fire pits lined with stones that would absorb and radiate heat long after the flames died down. They discovered which woods burned cleanly and which filled their shelters with choking smoke. But fuel was always a problem. In friendly territory, soldiers might be able to forage for deadwood or even purchase fuel from local peasants. But in enemy lands or during long sieges, every piece of burnable material became precious. They learned to burn anything: furniture looted from abandoned buildings, broken wagon wheels, even pieces of their own equipment when desperation set in. Some armies carried charcoal, which burned hotter and cleaner than wood, but was heavy to transport and expensive to acquire. The really clever soldiers learned the art of the shared fire. Multiple men would crowd around a single heat source, their bodies forming a human windscreen while they took turns feeding the flames. They developed sleeping arrangements that maximized shared body heat. 3 or 4 soldiers would sleep pressed together, rotating positions throughout the night, so everyone got some time in the warm middle spot. It wasn't comfortable, and it certainly wasn't private, but it kept them alive. Personal warmth came from layers, but not the kind of high-tech layering system modern outdoors enthusiasts use. Medieval soldiers wore whatever they could get their hands on. A linen undertunic, a wool tunic over that, maybe a leather jerkin, and if they were truly fortunate, some kind of cloak or mantle. The wealthy might have fur-lined garments, but most soldiers made do with whatever wool they could acquire, often through means their mothers wouldn't approve of. Wool was the miracle fabric of the medieval world. Unlike linen or cotton, wool retained some insulating properties even when wet. It could be worn in layers, with each layer trapping air and creating insulation. Soldiers learned to stuff wool into gaps in their clothing, creating crude but effective padding. They discovered that wool socks, even rough homespun ones, could prevent frostbite in their feet. Many carried extra wool wrappings that could be wound around hands, feet, or any body part that was losing too much heat. But clothing was just part of the equation. Medieval soldiers had to master the art of keeping their extremities warm. Frostbitten fingers couldn't grip a sword. Frozen toes couldn't march. They learned techniques that seem almost primitive, but were surprisingly effective. Hand warming became a group activity. Soldiers would take turns breathing on each other's hands, creating small pockets of warm, moist air. They discovered that keeping hands tucked inside their clothing, against their bodies, could prevent frostbite during the worst cold snaps. Feet were an even bigger challenge. Wet feet in freezing temperatures were a recipe for disaster. Medieval military boots, when they existed at all, were often little more than leather wrappings or simple shoes that provided minimal protection. Soldiers learned to wrap their feet in layers of wool or linen, changing these wrappings regularly when possible. They discovered that keeping feet dry was more important than keeping them warm, and they developed techniques for drying wet footwear over small fires without scorching the leather. The most experienced veterans knew that movement was life. Standing still in bitter cold meant death, but the wrong kind of movement could exhaust a man and leave him even more vulnerable. They learned the art of controlled exercise, gentle movements that increased circulation without causing sweat that would later freeze. They developed group activities, mock sword drills or wrestling matches that served the dual purpose of maintaining fighting readiness and generating body heat. Food became fuel in the most literal sense. Medieval soldiers discovered that their bodies needed more calories in winter, not just for energy, but for the basic process of generating heat. Hot food wasn't just more pleasant, It was genuinely warming from the inside out. They learned to make the most of whatever rations they had, creating hot stews and broths that provided both nutrition and warmth. Even hot water became precious, a luxury that could warm hands, feet, or core body temperature. The psychological aspect of winter survival was just as important as the physical. Long, dark nights in freezing conditions could break a man's spirit as surely as any enemy weapon. Medieval soldiers developed their own forms of entertainment and morale maintenance. Stories were shared around fires, songs were sung to keep spirits up, and games were played to pass the endless hours of darkness. Veterans learned to watch for signs of despair in their comrades, knowing that a soldier who gave up hope was likely to give up on life itself. But perhaps most importantly, medieval soldiers learned to think ahead. They understood that winter survival wasn't just about enduring the current moment. It was about preparing for tomorrow, next week, next month. They learned to gather materials when they could, to repair equipment before it failed completely, to husband resources for the worst days yet to come. They developed an almost supernatural ability to read weather signs, knowing when to prepare for a storm and when they might get a brief respite. This knowledge wasn't written in manuals or taught in military academies. It was passed down from veteran to recruit, shared around campfires, learned through bitter experience and sometimes fatal mistakes. Each campaign added to this collective wisdom. Each winter survived contributed to a growing understanding of how humans could endure in conditions that seemed designed to kill them. And survive they did. Not all of them, certainly. Medieval chronicles are full of accounts of armies decimated by winter weather, of soldiers found frozen at their posts, of campaigns that ended not in victory or defeat, but in desperate retreats from an enemy that couldn't be fought with sword or bow. But enough survived to fight another day, to pass on their knowledge, to prove that human ingenuity and determination could triumph over even the harshest conditions nature could provide. These weren't superhuman warriors with special powers. They were ordinary men, farmers and craftsmen and younger sons with nothing to inherit, facing extraordinary circumstances with nothing but their wits and whatever equipment they could carry. Yet they developed survival techniques that modern military forces still study and adapt. They proved that the human capacity for adaptation, for finding ways to endure and overcome, knows no historical boundaries. Their methods were crude by today's standards, improvised and desperate, and often barely adequate. But they worked well enough to keep armies in the field through winters that would challenge modern soldiers with all their technological advantages. They represent a masterclass in making do with less, in finding solutions when giving up meant death, in the kind of resourcefulness that only comes from absolute necessity. As we settle into our warm beds tonight, perhaps we can appreciate not just how far we've come, but how much we can learn from those who came before us. Medieval soldiers surviving bitter winters weren't just enduring, they were innovating, adapting, and proving that the human spirit is remarkably difficult to freeze. Their diet during these frozen campaigns tells its own story of survival against impossible odds. When supply lines stretched thin or broke entirely, medieval soldiers became masters of finding nutrition in places that would turn modern stomachs. They learned which tree barks could be boiled into something resembling soup, which roots could be dug from frozen ground and cooked into a paste that provided calories, if not flavour. Acorns, when they could find them, were processed through techniques borrowed from desperate peasants, leached of their bitterness and ground into a flour that could stretch existing grain supplies. The soldiers who lasted longest were those who understood that every calorie counted. They learned to save the fat from any meat they could acquire, not just for its flavour, but because fat provided twice the energy of other foods. A small piece of bacon fat could be melted into hot water to create a broth that warmed from within and provided essential energy for the body's constant battle against the cold. They discovered that certain spices, when available, didn't just make terrible food more palatable, but actually helped the body generate heat. pepper, ginger, and other warming spices became more valuable than gold in winter camps. Water presented its own deadly puzzle. Finding it was one challenge, keeping it liquid was another, and making it safe to drink was a third problem that could kill as surely as any sword. Medieval armies learned to position their camps near running water when possible, since flowing streams were less likely to freeze completely than still ponds or lakes. But even running water could become a sheet of ice, and breaking through required constant effort and precious energy. When natural water sources failed, soldiers became experts at melting snow and ice, but they learned through hard experience that eating snow directly was dangerous, rapidly cooling the body's core temperature. Instead, they developed techniques for efficient melting, using heated stones or metal implements to turn ice into water without wasting fuel. They discovered that different types of snow and ice melted at different rates and provided different qualities of water. The clever ones learned to collect water during the day, when temperatures might rise enough to create small pools or drips from melting ice. They used every container they could find, from helmets to cooking pots to improvised vessels made from animal bladders or scraped hides. Water was stored close to their bodies when possible, using body heat to prevent it from freezing solid during the night. But even liquid water could be deadly if it wasn't clean. Medieval soldiers didn't understand bacteria or viruses, but they understood that some water sources made men sick while others didn't. They learned to boil water when fuel allowed, not knowing they were killing pathogens, but observing that boiled water seemed safer. They discovered that adding certain herbs or even alcohol to questionable water could make it less likely to cause the flux or fever. Wine and ale, when available, weren't just luxury items but practical necessities. The alcohol content helped prevent freezing, and the liquid provided both hydration and calories. Medieval armies often carried more ale than water, understanding that fermented beverages were generally safer to drink than whatever water they might find along the march. A soldier with a skin of weak ale could survive longer than one, depending solely on questionable water sources. Personal hygiene became a delicate balance between cleanliness and survival. Too much washing in freezing conditions could be fatal, but too little led to infections and diseases that could spread through crowded camps like wildfire. Medieval soldiers learned to clean themselves strategically, washing hands and face when possible, but avoiding full baths that could lead to dangerous drops in body temperature. They discovered that certain practices actually helped with warmth retention. Keeping hair and beards longer provided natural insulation for the head and face. They learned which parts of the body could be safely exposed for cleaning and which needed to remain covered at all times. Some developed techniques for washing with snow, rubbing it quickly against the skin before drying immediately, a practice that cleaned while also stimulating circulation. Clothing maintenance became a matter of life and death. A torn cloak or damaged boots could mean the difference between surviving a winter campaign and becoming another casualty of the cold. Soldiers learned basic repair techniques using whatever materials they could find. Sinew from animals could serve as thread. Pieces of leather from damaged equipment could patch holes in boots or gloves. Even scraps of cloth from the dead could be repurposed to keep the living warm. The most experienced campaigners understood that their equipment needed as much care as their bodies. Metal weapons and armour required constant attention to prevent rust and damage from freezing and thawing cycles. They learned to oil their weapons regularly, not just to keep them sharp, but to prevent the metal from cracking in extreme cold. Leather needed to be kept supple with whatever oils or fats they could acquire, understanding that stiff, frozen leather would crack and become useless. Footwear received special attention because frozen feet meant death. Soldiers learned to stuff their boots with straw, wool, or even dried grass to provide extra insulation. They discovered techniques for drying wet boots without cracking the leather, using heated stones or positioning them carefully near fires. Some learned to make crude snowshoes from branches and rope, allowing them to move more easily through deep snow without exhausting themselves. But perhaps the most crucial survival skill was learning to conserve energy while maintaining readiness for combat. Winter campaigns didn't pause for weather, and soldiers needed to be able to fight effectively, even in the worst conditions. They learned to move efficiently through snow and ice, understanding how to step and where to place their feet to avoid exhaustion. They developed techniques for keeping weapons ready despite frozen hands and limited dexterity. Combat in winter presented unique challenges that peacetime training rarely addressed. Sword hilts became slippery with ice, bowstrings could snap in extreme cold, armour that fit properly in summer could become impossible to move in when layered over winter clothing. Medieval soldiers learned to adapt their fighting techniques to winter conditions, developing grips and stances that worked even when they couldn't feel their fingers. The psychological warfare of winter was perhaps the most insidious enemy. Long nights and bitter cold could break men's spirits, even when their bodies remained intact. Depression, despair, and what we might now recognise as seasonal affective disorder could render soldiers as useless as any physical wound. Veterans learned to recognise the signs and developed crude but effective methods for maintaining morale. Storytelling became a survival skill. Around the small fires that provided both warmth and gathering places, soldiers shared tales that transported them mentally from their frozen misery to warmer times and places. These weren't just entertainment, but psychological medicine, keeping minds engaged and spirits alive when everything else seemed designed to crush hope. They learned to create small routines and rituals that provided structure and purpose during the endless dark hours. Simple tasks like maintaining equipment, sharing food, or organising sleeping arrangements became anchors of normalcy in an abnormal situation. Veterans understood that keeping busy, even with seemingly pointless activities, was better than allowing men to sit idle and contemplate their misery. Music, when instruments survived the conditions, became another tool for psychological survival. Songs could raise spirits, coordinate work, and provide a sense of unity among men who might otherwise feel isolated and alone. Even simple rhythmic chanting while marching could help maintain morale and pace during difficult movements through snow and ice. The bonds formed between soldiers during winter campaigns often lasted lifetimes. Men who had shared body heat, food, and the constant presence of death developed relationships that went beyond ordinary military camaraderie. They learned to read each other's conditions, knowing when a comrade was approaching the edge of endurance and needed help. They developed systems of mutual support that could keep an entire unit functioning, even when individual members reached their limits. Leadership during winter campaigns required special skills that weren't taught in any manual. Officers learned to balance the need for military discipline with the reality that survival sometimes required bending rules. They had to judge when to push men forward and when rest was more important than progress. They learned to make decisions about resource allocation that could mean life or death for their soldiers. The best winter commanders understood that their own example could make or break unit morale. Officers who shared the hardships of their men, who didn't claim special privileges during the worst conditions, could inspire loyalty that went far beyond normal military obedience. They learned to project confidence even when they felt none, understanding that their soldiers needed to believe that survival was possible. Communication became crucial when weather conditions could scatter units and make normal military organisation impossible. Medieval armies developed systems of signals and messages that worked even in blizzards or heavy snow. They learned to use landmarks, natural features, and improvised markers to maintain unit cohesion when visibility was limited. Navigation in winter presented challenges that could doom entire expeditions. Familiar landmarks disappeared under snow. Rivers and roads became indistinguishable from surrounding terrain. Medieval soldiers learned to read subtle signs that remained visible even in harsh conditions, understanding how to use the position of the sun, the direction of prevailing winds, and the lay of the land to maintain their bearings. They discovered that certain natural features could provide both navigation aids and shelter. Rock formations that might be ignored in summer became crucial windbreaks and landmarks in winter. Valleys that were pleasant routes in warm weather became death traps where cold air collected. Hills that were obstacles in fair weather became refuges from the worst winds and cold. The rhythm of winter campaigning was different from summer warfare. Activities had to be planned around the limited daylight hours. Important tasks needed to be completed before the temperature dropped with the setting sun. Soldiers learned to accomplish as much as possible during the few hours when conditions were merely terrible instead of life-threatening. They developed an almost supernatural sense of weather patterns, learning to read clouds, wind direction, and subtle temperature changes that could predict incoming storms. This knowledge could mean the difference between finding shelter before a blizzard and being caught in the open when conditions turned deadly. Veterans could often predict weather changes hours in advance, allowing them to prepare or seek better positions before conditions deteriorated. The timing of these weather predictions was everything. Medieval soldiers learned that the hour before dawn was often the coldest, when men's resistance was lowest and death came most easily. They developed techniques for getting through these deadly hours, understanding that if they could survive until sunrise, they might make it through another day. Veterans would stay awake during these crucial periods, moving among sleeping men to check for signs of hypothermia or frostbite, knowing that a soldier who slipped into unconsciousness during the pre-dawn cold might never wake up. They learned to recognize the subtle signs that preceded the worst weather. The way smoke from fires behaved differently before a storm. How animals, when any could be found, changed their behavior before temperature drops. The particular quality of silence that settled over the landscape before heavy snow. These weren't superstitions but practical observations refined through seasons of bitter experience. Snow itself became both enemy and ally, depending on how cleverly it was used. Fresh snow could be packed into walls for wind protection, but soldiers learned that different types of snow had different properties. Wet, heavy snow could collapse shelters, while light, powdery snow provided better insulation but offered less structural support. Veterans could judge snow conditions by sight, sound, and feel, understanding which types could be safely used for construction and which needed to be avoided. The most experienced soldiers learned to build snow caves when conditions allowed, understanding principles of thermal dynamics they couldn't name but could apply with deadly accuracy. These shelters, carved into snowbanks or drifts, could maintain temperatures well above the outside air while remaining completely hidden from enemy observation. The entrance was always built lower than the sleeping area, allowing cold air to sink away from the occupants, while warm air rose to where it was needed most. But snow caves required specific conditions and considerable energy to construct. More often, soldiers had to make do with whatever natural or man-made shelter they could find or create. Abandoned buildings became precious resources, even when they were little more than ruins. A partially collapsed barn or a roofless cottage could provide enough wind protection to save lives. Soldiers learned to reinforce these structures quickly and efficiently, using rubble, branches, or even piled equipment to block the worst gaps. Underground spaces were treasured when they could be found. Root cellars, storage pits, even old wells could provide refuge from surface winds and temperatures. The earth itself, even when frozen solid on top, retained enough warmth below ground to make a crucial difference. Soldiers learned to dig when the ground allowed, creating dugouts and trenches that could house multiple men while protecting them from the worst weather. Fire management in these shelters required skills that bordered on artistry. Too much fire in an enclosed space could use up all available oxygen or fill the area with deadly smoke. Too little provided insufficient warmth. Medieval soldiers learned to create ventilation systems using whatever materials they had, understanding that fresh air was as important as warmth for survival. They developed techniques for banking fires, that could burn safely through the night without constant attention, using combinations of different materials that would burn at controlled rates. The fuel for these fires came from increasingly desperate sources as winter campaigns wore on. Soldiers learned to burn anything combustible, from broken wagon parts to leather equipment they could no longer use. They discovered which materials burned cleanly and which created dangerous smoke. Dried animal dung, when available, became precious fuel that burned hot and relatively clean. Even old bones could be used, providing slow-burning heat that lasted through long winter nights. But fuel gathering was dangerous work that exposed men to the elements and to enemy action. Soldiers learned to forage efficiently, understanding which dead wood burned best and where it was most likely to be found. They developed techniques for breaking down larger pieces without axes or proper tools, using rocks, other pieces of wood, or even the weight of their own bodies to split logs into manageable pieces. The sharing of resources became a complex social system that could mean the difference between unit survival and total collapse. Food, fuel, and shelter materials had to be distributed in ways that kept everyone alive while maintaining military discipline. Veterans learned to judge these allocations carefully, understanding that favoritism could destroy morale while complete equality might not account for different individual needs or contributions. Some soldiers required more calories due to their size or duties. Others had medical conditions that made them more vulnerable to cold. The best units developed informal systems of mutual support that accounted for these differences while maintaining overall fairness. Men would share body heat, food, and equipment based on need and ability rather than strict military hierarchy. Water discipline became as important as any other military skill. Soldiers learned to manage their water consumption carefully, understanding that dehydration could be as dangerous as freezing. They developed techniques for rationing liquid intake while ensuring that everyone received enough to maintain health. Ice and snow were processed efficiently, with methods for melting that conserved fuel while producing the maximum amount of safe drinking water. The purification of water became a survival skill that saved countless lives, even though medieval soldiers didn't understand the scientific principles involved. They learned through observation and experience that certain treatments made water safer to drink. Boiling was preferred when fuel allowed, but they also discovered that adding wine or vinegar could help purify questionable water sources. Some learned that letting water settle and clearing could remove visible impurities, though they had no way of knowing about invisible dangers. Personal waste management in winter camps required careful planning to prevent disease while conserving warmth and energy. Soldiers learned to designate specific areas downwind and away from water sources for latrines, understanding that poor sanitation could kill more effectively than enemy weapons. They developed techniques for maintaining these facilities even in frozen conditions, using whatever materials they could find to create basic privacy and weather protection. The maintenance of personal cleanliness became a balancing act between health and survival. Too much washing could be fatal in extreme cold, but too little led to infections and diseases that could spread rapidly through crowded camps. Soldiers learned to clean strategically, focusing on hands, face and feet when possible, while keeping the rest of their bodies covered and warm. They discovered that certain practices, like changing into dry clothes when possible, could prevent serious health problems. Clothing repairs required constant attention and improvised materials. Thread was precious and often unavailable, so soldiers learned to use strips of cloth, animal sinew, or even unravelled rope to mend torn garments. They discovered techniques for patching holes using pieces of leather, cloth, or even carefully prepared animal skins. Every scrap of material became potentially useful for keeping clothes functional and protective. The art of layering became increasingly sophisticated as soldiers learned through experience what combinations worked best. They understood that loose layers trapped more air and provided better insulation than tight-fitting clothes. They learned to avoid materials that held moisture against the skin, preferring wool and other fabrics that retained some insulating properties even when damp. Veterans could judge the quality of different textiles by touch, knowing which materials would serve them best in extreme conditions. Footwear maintenance required special attention because frozen feet could end a soldier's career or life. Men learned to dry boots and shoes carefully, using heated stones or positioning them precisely near fires to remove moisture without damaging the leather. They discovered that stuffing boots with dry materials overnight could help maintain their shape while absorbing residual moisture. Some learned to make crude repairs using whatever leather, cloth, or cordage they could find. The preservation of weapons and equipment became a daily ritual that could determine survival in combat situations. Metal weapons needed constant care to prevent rust and damage from freeze-thaw cycles. Soldiers learned to oil their swords, spears, and armour regularly using whatever fats or oils they could obtain. They discovered that certain treatments could help protect metal from the worst effects of winter weather. Bowstrings required special attention in winter conditions, as cold could make them brittle and prone to snapping at crucial moments. Archers learned to keep spare strings warm and dry, often carrying them inside their clothing next to their bodies. They developed techniques for protecting bows from moisture and extreme temperature changes, understanding that a broken bow could leave them defenseless. Leather equipment, from belts to scabbards to armor components, needed regular treatment to prevent cracking and stiffening. Soldiers learned to work whatever oils or fats they could obtain into leather goods, keeping them supple and functional. They discovered that frozen leather could shatter like wood, making regular maintenance a matter of life and death. The psychology of equipment maintenance was as important as the practical aspects. Having something productive to do during the long, dark hours helped maintain morale while ensuring that gear remained functional. Veterans understood that the ritual of caring for weapons and equipment provided structure and purpose that could help men cope with the psychological stress of winter campaigns. Sleep management became a crucial survival skill that required careful planning and coordination. Soldiers learned to sleep in shifts, ensuring that someone was always awake to tend fires and watch for dangers. They developed techniques for sharing body heat efficiently, rotating positions so that everyone got some time in the warmest spots. Veterans understood that proper rest was essential for survival, but that sleeping incorrectly could be fatal. The challenge of maintaining alertness during guard duty in extreme cold tested human endurance to its limits. Soldiers learned techniques for staying awake and alert when their bodies wanted nothing more than to shut down. They developed exercises and mental practices that could help maintain focus during long cold watches. Veterans understood that a sleeping sentry could doom an entire unit, making watchfulness a shared responsibility. Dream management became an unexpected survival skill as soldiers learned to cope with the psychological effects of extreme stress and discomfort. Nightmares about freezing, starving, or dying could affect morale as much as actual hardships. Veterans learned to share techniques for managing disturbing dreams and maintaining mental health during the long, dark months of winter campaigning. The bonds formed between soldiers during these harsh conditions often lasted for life, creating relationships that went far beyond normal military camaraderie. Men who had shared warmth, food, and the constant presence of death developed trust and loyalty that could withstand any test. These relationships became part of the survival system itself, as soldiers learned to depend on each other in ways that peacetime service never required. Communication systems had to function even when normal military protocols became impossible due to weather conditions. Soldiers developed methods for passing messages and maintaining contact when visibility was limited and movement was dangerous. They learned to use signals that worked in snow and wind, understanding that communication failures could be as deadly as enemy action. The rhythm of winter campaigns created its own culture and traditions, as soldiers adapted their behaviour to the demands of survival. Mealtimes became social events that provided warmth and companionship as well as nutrition. The sharing of stories, songs, and news became important for maintaining morale and unit cohesion. Veterans understood that these social aspects of survival were as important as the physical techniques. Medical care in winter conditions required improvised techniques and materials that would challenge modern emergency medicine. Soldiers learned to recognize and treat frostbite, hypothermia, and other cold-related injuries using whatever resources they had available. They developed methods for keeping wounded men warm while treating their injuries, understanding that cold could kill faster than wounds in many cases. The treatment of common winter ailments became a shared body of knowledge passed down from veteran to recruit. Soldiers learned to recognize the early signs of pneumonia, bronchitis, and other respiratory diseases that thrived in cold, crowded conditions. They discovered which herbs and treatments might help with these conditions, though their understanding was based on observation rather than medical science. Herbal medicine took on new importance as soldiers learned which plants might still be available even in winter conditions and which could help with cold-related health problems. Tree barks, evergreen needles, and other materials that remained available in frozen conditions became important sources of vitamins and minerals that could prevent scurvy and other nutritional diseases. The management of existing injuries and chronic conditions became more challenging in winter weather. Wounds that might heal normally in warm conditions could become infected or fail to heal properly in extreme cold. Soldiers learned to protect existing injuries while dealing with the additional stress that winter conditions placed on their bodies. Mental health management became as important as physical health care, as the psychological stress of winter campaigns took its toll on even the strongest men. Veterans learned to recognize the signs of despair, depression, and mental breakdown that could render soldiers ineffective or dangerous. They developed crude but effective methods for providing psychological support and maintaining unit morale. The end of winter campaigns brought its own challenges as soldiers had to readjust to normal conditions while dealing with the physical and psychological effects of their ordeal. Many carried permanent reminders in the form of missing fingers or toes lost to frostbite. Others bore psychological scars that would affect them for the rest of their lives. But they survived. Against odds that would challenge modern soldiers with all their technological advantages, these medieval warriors found ways to endure conditions that seemed designed to kill them. Their techniques were crude, their resources limited, their knowledge based on observation rather than science. Yet they developed survival systems that kept armies in the field through winters that claimed more lives than any enemy ever did. Their legacy lives on in the recognition that human ingenuity and determination can triumph over even the most hostile conditions. They proved that survival isn't just about having the right equipment or perfect conditions, but about the willingness to adapt, to improvise, and to never give up even when everything seems hopeless. These weren't superhuman warriors with special powers. They were ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances, with nothing but their wits and their will to live. Yet they accomplished something remarkable, proving that the human spirit is remarkably difficult to freeze, no matter how bitter the winter or how desperate the conditions. Their stories weren't recorded in glorious chronicles or celebrated in epic poems. These were the forgotten details, the gritty reality behind the romantic tales of medieval warfare. While nobles feasted in warm halls, common soldiers learned that survival meant mastering 1,000 small skills that no military manual ever bothered to document. Take the art of fire management, something so fundamental yet so perilous that it could determine whether a unit saw another dawn. Medieval soldiers became experts in reading flame and smoke like ancient texts. They learned to distinguish between the clean burn of dry oak and the acrid smoke of green wood that could choke a man in his sleep. They discovered that certain woods popped and sparked dangerously, while others burned steadily through the night without betraying their position to enemy scouts. The most experienced veterans could build fires that produced maximum heat with minimal smoke, understanding that visibility to the enemy was often as dangerous as freezing to death. They learned to create fire pits lined with stones that would continue radiating warmth long after the flames died. These heated stones became precious resources, carefully wrapped in cloth and tucked inside clothing to provide hours of gentle warmth against frozen skin. But perhaps most importantly, they mastered the delicate balance of fuel conservation. Every piece of wood, every scrap of burnable material had to be rationed with the precision of a master accountant. They learned to burn only what was necessary, when it was necessary, understanding that tomorrow's fuel might be even scarcer than today's. Veterans developed an almost supernatural ability to judge how much fuel would be needed to get through a night, calculating the burn rate against the dropping temperature with accuracy born of desperate experience. The hierarchy of warmth in medieval camps followed its own brutal logic. Not all soldiers were created equal when it came to survival privileges. Veterans, those who had proven their worth through multiple campaigns, often claimed the best positions near fires and the most effective shelter. They had earned these privileges through experience, but more importantly, they had learned how to survive in conditions that killed newcomers. Fresh recruits, the young men who had never faced a winter campaign, found themselves on the cold periphery of camp life. They slept in the worst spots, ate the least appetizing rations, and learned through harsh experience that survival was a skill that had to be earned. Many didn't live long enough to become veterans themselves. The lucky ones found mentors, older soldiers who took pity on their inexperience and taught them the 1,000 small tricks that separated the living from the frozen dead. This mentorship system wasn't official military policy. It was an organic development born of necessity and rough compassion. Veterans understood that keeping recruits alive wasn't just moral duty, it was practical necessity. Dead soldiers couldn't fight, and experienced men who died of exposure couldn't pass on their knowledge. The informal education that took place around winter campfires was perhaps more valuable than any formal military training. These lessons covered everything from the obvious to the obscure. New soldiers learned not to touch metal with bare skin in extreme cold, discovering that flesh could freeze instantly to iron or steel. They learned to breathe through their noses rather than their mouths to warm incoming air before it hit their lungs. They discovered that eating snow directly could lower their core body temperature dangerously, while melted snow water could provide crucial hydration without the thermal shock. More subtle lessons took longer to absorb. Veterans taught recruits to recognize the early signs of frostbite, the telltale tingling and numbness that preceded more serious damage. They learned to check each other for signs of hypothermia, understanding that a man in the early stages might not recognize his own condition. The buddy system wasn't just military organization, it was a survival network where each soldier's life depended on his comrade's vigilance. The management of personal waste became a subject worthy of careful study, though no military treatise would ever acknowledge it. In summer campaigns, soldiers could simply walk away from camp to relieve themselves. Winter changed everything. Exposed skin in freezing temperatures could lead to frostbite in sensitive areas, while the process of undressing and redressing in extreme cold could be genuinely dangerous. Experienced soldiers learned to time these necessities carefully, waiting for the warmest parts of the day when possible, and preparing their clothing for rapid adjustment. They discovered which garments could be loosened quickly and which required too much exposure to cold air. Some learned to construct crude but effective privacy shelters that provided wind protection during vulnerable moments. The psychological impact of these basic human needs couldn't be ignored. Dignity and privacy, luxuries in the best of times, became almost impossible to maintain during winter campaigns. Soldiers learned to balance modesty with survival, understanding that false shame could be literally fatal. Veterans developed techniques for maintaining some semblance of personal dignity, while acknowledging the reality that survival sometimes required abandoning peacetime standards of behaviour. Hygiene presented similar challenges that required creative solutions. Washing with water in freezing temperatures could be suicidal, yet complete neglect of cleanliness led to infections and diseases that could spread rapidly through crowded camps. Medieval soldiers developed compromise solutions that balanced health with survival. They learned to clean themselves strategically, focusing on areas most prone to infection, while leaving other parts of their bodies protected by layers of clothing. Hands and faces received the most attention, as these were exposed to the elements and most likely to develop problems. Some soldiers learned to wash quickly with snow, rubbing it against their skin before drying immediately with cloth or leather. Dental care became another survival challenge that could have serious consequences. Tooth problems that might be minor inconveniences in peacetime could become debilitating issues during winter campaigns. Soldiers learned to protect their teeth from extreme cold, breathing through their noses and avoiding biting down on frozen foods that could crack weakened teeth. Some learned to pack painful teeth with cloth or other materials to provide insulation from cold air. The maintenance of mental health required techniques that wouldn't be formally recognized for centuries, but were intuitively understood by experienced soldiers. The long dark nights of winter campaigns could break men's spirits as effectively as any physical hardship. Veterans learned to watch for signs of despair and depression in their comrades, understanding that a soldier who lost hope was likely to make fatal mistakes. Storytelling became a form of medicine, transporting men mentally from their frozen misery to warmer times and places. These weren't just entertainment, but psychological necessities that helped maintain sanity during the endless dark hours. Veterans collected stories like treasures, understanding that a good tale could lift spirits when nothing else would work. Music served a similar function, when instruments survived the conditions and men had energy to play them. Simple songs could unite scattered soldiers, providing rhythm for work and comfort for rest. Even crude chanting or rhythmic clapping could help men coordinate activities while maintaining morale. The sound of human voices raised in song became a declaration of life in the face of conditions designed to extinguish it. Games and contests provided another form of psychological survival, giving men something to think about besides their misery. Simple gambling with dice or stones could occupy minds during the worst weather. Wrestling matches and contests of strength helped maintain physical fitness while providing entertainment. Even crude jokes and humour became weapons against despair, proving that the human spirit could find laughter in the darkest circumstances. The rhythm of winter campaigns created its own culture, different from summer warfare, and unlike anything in peacetime life. Soldiers learned to organise their days around the limited hours of daylight, understanding that important activities needed to be completed before the sun set and temperatures plummeted. They developed schedules that maximised productivity during the warmest parts of the day while conserving energy during the coldest hours. Meal preparation became a social event that served multiple purposes beyond simple nutrition. Gathering around cooking fires provided warmth and companionship while the food was being prepared. The sharing of rations, even meagre ones, reinforced unit bonds and ensured that no soldier went without sustenance. Veterans learned to stretch small amounts of food into satisfying meals that provided both physical nourishment and psychological comfort. The art of conversation during these meals became a survival skill in itself. Topics had to be chosen carefully to maintain morale without dwelling on hardships or fears. Veterans learned to guide discussions toward positive subjects, sharing memories of home, plans for after the campaign, or humorous stories from previous experiences. The ability to maintain hopeful conversation, even in desperate circumstances, became as valuable as any military skill. Sleep arrangements required constant negotiation and adjustment as conditions changed throughout the winter. Soldiers learned to sleep in shifts, ensuring that someone was always awake to tend fires and watch for danger. They developed systems for sharing the warmest sleeping spots, rotating positions so that everyone got some time in the most protected areas. The fairness of these arrangements could make the difference between a cohesive unit and one torn apart by resentment and conflict. The challenge of maintaining military discipline during extreme hardship tested the leadership skills of officers and non-commissioned leaders. Normal military protocols often had to be modified to account for survival necessities. Leaders learned to balance the need for order with the reality that rigid adherence to peacetime rules could get men killed in winter conditions. Punishment systems had to be adjusted for conditions where additional hardship could be fatal. Officers learned to find consequences that maintained discipline without endangering lives. Extra duties, reduced rations, or exclusion from the warmest positions could be effective punishments that didn't require the physical penalties used in milder weather. The most effective winter leaders were those who shared the hardships of their men while maintaining the authority necessary for military function. They learned to lead by example, demonstrating that survival was possible while maintaining the standards necessary for effective fighting. These leaders often became legendary figures whose reputations lasted long after their deaths, remembered not just for their military victories, but for their ability to keep men alive under impossible conditions. Medical care in winter conditions challenged every assumption about treating injuries and illness. Wounds that might heal quickly in warm weather could become infected or fail to heal properly in extreme cold. Soldiers learned to protect injuries from cold air while maintaining cleanliness as much as possible. They discovered that certain treatments worked better in cold conditions, while others became ineffective or even dangerous. The treatment of cold-related injuries required knowledge and techniques that were passed down from veteran to recruit through practical demonstration. Frostbite recognition and treatment became essential skills that could save fingers, toes, or lives. Soldiers learned to rewarm frozen extremities gradually, understanding that rapid warming could cause more damage than the original injury. Hypothermia treatment required techniques that seemed counterintuitive, but proved effective through experience. Veterans learned that the warming process had to be gradual and carefully controlled, using body heat and gentle warming rather than direct heat from fires. They discovered that a hypothermic soldier needed protection from further heat loss while being slowly brought back to normal temperature. The prevention of cold injuries became as important as their treatment. Soldiers learned to recognize the early warning signs that preceded serious problems, understanding that intervention at the first symptoms could prevent permanent damage. They developed techniques for maintaining circulation in extremities, using exercises and position changes that could prevent frostbite before it occurred. Respiratory problems flourished in the cold, crowded conditions of winter camps, requiring treatments based on observation and experience rather than medical knowledge. Soldiers learned to recognize the symptoms of pneumonia, bronchitis, and other lung diseases that could spread rapidly through units. They discovered that certain treatments, like inhaling steam from hot water or breathing warmed air, could provide relief for respiratory symptoms. The management of existing medical conditions became more challenging in winter weather, as chronic problems were often aggravated by cold and stress. Soldiers with old injuries learned to protect weakened areas from further damage while dealing with increased pain and stiffness. Those with respiratory conditions had to be especially careful to avoid exposure that could trigger serious episodes. Nutritional deficiencies became serious problems during extended winter campaigns when fresh food was unavailable for months. Soldiers learned to recognize the symptoms of scurvy, pellagra, and other diseases caused by poor diet. They discovered that certain preserved foods, tree bark, or evergreen needles could provide vitamins that prevented these conditions. The social dynamics of winter camps created their own survival challenges that required careful management. The close quarters and shared hardships could either forge strong bonds or create conflicts that could destroy unit effectiveness. Veterans learned to mediate disputes and manage personalities in ways that maintained unit cohesion under stress. Leadership roles often shifted during winter campaigns as formal military hierarchy proved less important than practical survival skills. Soldiers who demonstrated knowledge and competence in winter survival sometimes gained influence, regardless of their official rank. These informal leaders became crucial for unit survival, often serving as advisors to officers who lacked winter experience. The treatment of different nationalities and social classes within medieval armies required adjustment during winter campaigns. Survival became the great equalizer, as noble birth provided little protection against freezing to death. Soldiers learned that cooperation across traditional social boundaries was often necessary for survival, leading to temporary breakdowns of normal social hierarchies. Women in medieval military camps, whether camp followers, wives, or disguised soldiers, faced additional challenges during winter campaigns. They often possessed valuable skills in textile work, food preparation, and medical care that became crucial for survival. Their presence could provide emotional support that helped maintain male morale, though they also required protection and resources that strained already limited supplies. The care of animals during winter campaigns presented challenges that could affect military effectiveness. Horses, oxen, and other working animals required shelter, food, and care that competed with human needs. Soldiers learned to balance animal welfare with human survival, understanding that dead animals could mean failed campaigns, but that caring for animals couldn't come at the cost of human lives. The logistics of feeding animals during winter required creativity and careful resource management. Soldiers learned to gather fodder when possible, storing it against future need. They discovered which materials could serve as emergency animal feed and how to stretch limited supplies to keep working animals alive. The death of transport animals could doom a campaign by making movement impossible. The psychological bond between soldiers and their animals became important for morale during winter campaigns. Horses and dogs provided companionship and emotional support that helped men cope with the isolation and hardship of winter warfare. The care of these animals gave soldiers a sense of purpose and responsibility that could help maintain mental health. Navigation during winter storms required skills that could mean the difference between reaching safety and wandering lost until death found them. Soldiers learned to read natural signs that remained visible even in heavy snow, using wind direction, the angle of snow drifts, and subtle terrain features to maintain their bearings. They discovered that certain landmarks could be identified even when buried under snow. The construction of emergency shelters during sudden storms tested every survival skill soldiers had learned. They had to work quickly, in dangerous conditions, using whatever materials were available to create protection from wind and cold. These shelters were often crude and temporary, designed to keep men alive until conditions improved, rather than provide comfortable accommodation. The timing of travel during winter campaigns required careful judgment that balanced the need for movement with the dangers of exposure. Soldiers learned to recognize weather patterns that might provide safe travel windows and to judge when conditions were too dangerous for movement. The decision to travel or shelter could determine whether units reached their destinations or perished in the wilderness. Communication during winter storms challenged every method of military coordination. Normal signal systems became useless in heavy snow or extreme cold. Soldiers learned to maintain contact using sound signals, rope lines, or other methods that functioned when visibility was zero. The failure of communication systems could scatter units and lead to individual deaths from exposure. The end of winter campaigns brought its own set of challenges, as soldiers had to readjust to normal conditions while dealing with the physical and psychological effects of their ordeal. Many carried permanent disabilities from frostbite, malnutrition, or injuries that had healed poorly in cold conditions. Others bore mental scars that would affect them for years or even decades. The transition back to civilian life for for soldiers who survived winter campaigns often proved difficult, as few people could understand what they had endured. Veterans formed informal networks of mutual support, sharing their experiences with others who had faced similar ordeals. These bonds often lasted for life, creating relationships that transcended normal social boundaries. The knowledge gained during winter campaigns was passed down through generations of soldiers, creating a body of survival wisdom that was never formally recorded but was preserved through oral tradition. Each campaign added to this collective understanding, as new challenges required new solutions and innovations. The medical consequences of winter campaigns often lasted far beyond the immediate survival period. Soldiers who lost fingers or toes to frostbite faced lifetime disabilities that affected their ability to work or fight. Respiratory damage from breathing cold air or smoke could cause chronic problems that shortened lives. Joint damage from sleeping on frozen ground could cause arthritis and mobility problems that lasted for decades. The economic impact of winter campaigns extended far beyond their immediate military costs. Soldiers who returned home disabled required support from their families and communities. The knowledge and skills lost when experienced men died of exposure represented a significant drain on military capabilities. The psychological trauma of winter warfare could affect entire generations of military families. Yet despite all these challenges and costs, medieval armies continued to campaign through winter because military necessity demanded it. Wars didn't pause for weather, and strategic advantages often required movement during the worst possible conditions. The soldiers who learned to survive these campaigns proved that human determination and ingenuity could triumph over conditions that seemed designed to be fatal. Their legacy lives on in the understanding that survival isn't just about having the right equipment or perfect conditions, but about the will to adapt, improvise, and persevere when everything seems hopeless. They demonstrated that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when their survival depended on it, finding solutions to problems that would challenge modern experts with all their technological advantages. These medieval soldiers, forgotten by history, except as statistics in military records, prove something fundamental about human nature. They showed that people could endure almost anything if they had reason to hope, companions to share the burden, and the knowledge that others had survived similar ordeals before them. Their techniques were crude by modern standards, their resources limited, their understanding based on observation rather than science. Yet they developed survival systems that kept armies functional through winters that claimed more lives than enemy weapons ever did. They proved that the human spirit, like the embers of a carefully banked fire, is remarkably difficult to extinguish, no matter how bitter the cold or how desperate the circumstances. In our warm, comfortable world, their example reminds us that survival has always depended more on determination and cooperation than on technology or luxury. They faced the worst that nature could offer, with nothing but wool, iron, and the unshakable belief that dawn would come again, even in the darkest depths of winter's frozen hell. As the winter months stretched endlessly before them, medieval soldiers discovered that their greatest enemy wasn't always the opposing army camped across frozen fields. It was the slow, creeping madness that came with months of darkness, cold, and the constant presence of death lurking just outside their inadequate shelters. The psychological warfare waged by winter itself could break men faster than any siege engine or cavalry charge. Veterans learned to recognize the warning signs early. A soldier who stopped maintaining his equipment, who no longer participated in the crude jokes and stories shared around guttering fires, who stared too long into the flames with empty eyes. These men were fighting a battle that couldn't be won with sword or spear. They were losing themselves, piece by piece, to the grinding monotony of survival, watching their hope freeze solid, like water left in a bowl overnight. The most experienced sergeants and camp followers developed crude but effective methods for combating this invisible enemy. They understood that keeping men busy was often more important than keeping them warm. Idle hands and empty minds became breeding grounds for despair that could spread through a unit faster than any disease. Simple tasks, meaningless busy work, the constant maintenance of weapons and equipment that might not even be necessary, all became tools in the fight against the crushing weight of hopelessness. Gambling became medicine disguised as vice. Dice games played with carved bones or stones gave men something to think about besides their misery. The stakes didn't matter, whether it was the last piece of dried meat or the promise to take first watch duty. What mattered was the engagement, the spark of competition that reminded frozen soldiers they were still alive, still human, still capable of caring about something beyond mere survival. But perhaps the most crucial psychological survival technique was the careful management of memory and hope. Veterans learned to ration their thoughts of home like precious supplies. Too much reminiscing about warm hearths and full bellies could break a man's spirit when faced with the reality of his frozen existence. Too little could leave him with nothing to fight for when the darkness seemed endless. The balance required skill that no military manual could teach. Stories became weapons in this war against despair. Not just any stories, but carefully chosen tales that transported listeners without reminding them too sharply of what they'd lost. Adventures of distant heroes, legends of impossible quests, even crude jokes that would make their mothers blush. The content mattered less than the effect, the momentary escape from the crushing reality of their situation. The rhythm of these story sessions developed its own rules and traditions. Veterans knew to begin with lighter tales, when spirits were lowest, gradually building to more complex narratives as their audience warmed to the telling. They learned to involve listeners, asking questions, encouraging embellishments, creating a collaborative escape that engaged minds grown dull with cold and desperation. Music served a similar function, though instruments were precious and fragile in winter conditions. A lute with strings snapped by cold was useless. A drum with a cracked head provided no rhythm. But human voices, raised in song despite chattering teeth and hoarse throats, could create magic that no instrument could match. Simple melodies, often songs learned in childhood, became bridges connecting frozen soldiers to their humanity. The choice of songs required the same careful consideration as stories. Lullabies could remind men too sharply of families they might never see again. Drinking songs could mock their current deprivation. But work songs, marching songs, simple rhythmic chants that matched the beat of shared tasks, these could unite men in common purpose while providing the psychological comfort of familiar melodies. Religious observances took on new meaning during winter campaigns, though they often bore little resemblance to the formal services of peacetime. Prayers became more urgent, more personal, stripped of elaborate ritual, and focused on the immediate needs of survival. Men who might have been indifferent to religious matters in comfortable circumstances found themselves bargaining desperately with whatever gods they believed might listen. These makeshift services, conducted by soldiers rather than priests, often combined elements of different faiths and traditions. A Christian prayer might be followed by an appeal to older gods, Germanic or Celtic deities who seemed more likely to understand the harsh realities of warfare. The theological purity mattered less than the psychological comfort provided by the belief that someone, somewhere, might be listening to their pleas for survival. The treatment of the dead during winter campaigns presented challenges that went far beyond the practical difficulties of frozen ground and limited resources. Bodies couldn't always be buried properly when the earth was harder than stone. Funeral rites had to be abbreviated when conducting them in full would expose mourners to fatal cold. Yet the psychological need to honour the dead remained crucial for the mental health of survivors. Veterans developed abbreviated rituals that could be performed quickly in harsh conditions while still providing closure for grieving comrades. Simple words spoken over wrapped bodies, brief moments of silence that acknowledged loss without dwelling on it. the distribution of a dead soldier's possessions in ways that honoured his memory while serving practical needs. These ceremonies were crude by peacetime standards, but served their purpose of helping survivors process grief while maintaining focus on their own survival. The management of fear required techniques that acknowledged terror while preventing it from becoming paralysing panic. Every soldier on a winter campaign lived with the constant awareness that death could come at any moment. Not gloriously in battle, but slowly, miserably, from cold or disease or simple exhaustion. Veterans learned to channel this fear into productive anxiety that sharpened reflexes and encouraged preparation rather than allowing it to become debilitating dread. They developed mental exercises, ways of thinking about danger that made it manageable rather than overwhelming. Fear of freezing to death could be transformed into motivation for gathering fuel and maintaining fires. Terror of starvation could become energy for foraging and careful rationing. Dread of disease could inspire attention to hygiene and care for minor ailments before they became serious problems. The concept of luck took on almost magical significance during winter campaigns. Soldiers developed elaborate superstitions and rituals designed to attract good fortune and ward off disaster. Lucky charms, whether religious medallions, unusual stones, or scraps of cloth from home, became precious possessions that provided psychological armour against the randomness of death in winter conditions. These superstitions often seemed absurd to outsiders, but served important psychological functions for the believers. The ritual of touching a lucky charm before leaving shelter, the careful arrangement of possessions in specific patterns, the observance of elaborate taboos designed to prevent bad luck. All these practices gave soldiers a sense of control in situations where they had no real power over their fate. Group superstitions could unite entire units in shared beliefs that strengthened social bonds while providing collective psychological support. Common rituals, shared lucky objects, unit-specific taboos that applied to everyone equally. These practices created identity and solidarity that helped men endure hardships that might otherwise break individual spirits. The rotation of duties and responsibilities became a crucial tool for maintaining mental health during extended winter campaigns. Men needed variety, even small changes in routine, to prevent the mind-numbing monotony that could lead to despair. Veterans learned to rotate assignments, not just for fairness, but for psychological necessity, ensuring that no soldier became trapped in the same deadening routine, day after day. Leadership responsibilities were sometimes shared among soldiers of different ranks, giving common troops opportunities to make decisions and exercise authority. This wasn't just practical cross-training, but psychological medicine that reminded men they were more than just expendable bodies. The opportunity to lead, even in small matters, could restore self-respect and sense of purpose that were crucial for mental survival. The treatment of illness took on special urgency during winter campaigns, not just because of the physical dangers, but because of the psychological impact on unit morale. A single soldier dying slowly of disease could spread despair through an entire unit as men imagined themselves suffering the same fate. Veterans learned to balance compassionate care with the need to maintain hope among healthy soldiers. Isolation of the seriously ill was sometimes necessary to prevent the spread of disease, but it had to be managed carefully to avoid creating the impression that sick soldiers were being abandoned to die alone. Rotating care duties, maintaining communication with isolated patients, ensuring that sick soldiers knew they hadn't been forgotten, these practices helped maintain unit cohesion while protecting overall health. The care of minor injuries and ailments became everyone's responsibility during winter campaigns when professional medical help was unavailable. Soldiers learned basic wound care, the treatment of common illnesses, and the recognition of symptoms that required immediate attention. This shared medical knowledge not only improved survival rates but gave men confidence that help would be available if they needed it. Herbal medicine flourished in winter camps as soldiers learned to identify and use whatever plant materials remained available during the cold months. Tree bark that could be brewed into teas for stomach ailments, evergreen needles that provided vitamins to prevent scurvy, roots that could be processed into poultices for wounds. This knowledge was passed down through practical demonstration, creating an informal medical tradition that supplemented whatever official care might be available. The preparation and preservation of medicines became a group activity that provided both practical benefits and psychological comfort. Gathering herbs during brief warm spells, drying and storing them properly, preparing remedies according to traditional recipes, these activities gave soldiers a sense of preparation and control over their health that was psychologically valuable even when the actual medical benefits were questionable. Personal hygiene practices had to be adapted not just for the physical challenges of winter, but for their psychological importance. Maintaining some semblance of cleanliness and grooming became a declaration of humanity in the face of dehumanizing conditions. Veterans understood that soldiers who completely abandoned personal care were often those who had given up hope of survival. The sharing of grooming tools and materials became another form of social bonding that reinforced unit cohesion. Helping comrades maintain their appearance, sharing scarce soap or oils, assisting with difficult tasks like cutting hair or trimming beards. These activities created intimacy and mutual dependence that strengthened the relationships crucial for psychological survival. Clothing repairs took on symbolic importance beyond their practical necessity. A soldier who took care to mend his garments, who made efforts to keep his equipment in good order, who maintained pride in his appearance despite harsh conditions, was demonstrating faith in his own survival. Veterans encouraged these behaviours not just for practical reasons, but because they indicated healthy mental states. The development of new skills during winter downtime provided psychological benefits that could help offset the grinding monotony of survival. Learning to carve wood, to work leather more effectively, to improve weapons maintenance techniques, to master new games or songs. These activities gave men goals and achievements that provided satisfaction and self-respect in otherwise demoralizing circumstances. Teaching these skills to others created hierarchies of knowledge that provided social structure and purpose beyond military rank. A common soldier who had mastered a particular craft could gain respect and authority within the informal camp society. This recognition provided psychological rewards that helped maintain self-worth and social identity during extended hardships. The creation of art and craft objects, however crude, became an important outlet for creative expression that helped maintain psychological health. Carved figures, decorated weapons, improvised musical instruments, even simple drawings scratched into leather or wood. These artistic efforts represented triumphs of human creativity over the dehumanizing effects of extreme hardship. The value of these objects went far beyond their practical utility. They represented time and energy devoted to beauty rather than mere survival, declarations that the human spirit could create as well as endure. Veterans encouraged these activities not just as entertainment, but as medicine for souls ground down by months of focusing solely on staying alive. Trade and exchange within winter camps created economic activity that provided psychological stimulation and social interaction. Soldiers bartered possessions, skills and services in complex networks that gave everyone opportunities to improve their situations through cleverness and negotiation rather than mere endurance. These transactions provided mental stimulation and social engagement that helped combat the isolation and despair of winter conditions. The informal markets that developed in larger camps became centres of social activity where news was shared, friendships formed, and morale maintained through human interaction. The opportunity to engage in commerce, however small scale, reminded soldiers of their civilian identities and provided hope for eventual return to normal economic life. Debt and credit systems developed within military units created social bonds and future obligations that encouraged mutual support. Soldiers who owed favours to comrades had reasons to ensure those comrades survived to collect. Those who were owed debts had additional motivation to maintain their own survival. These economic relationships supplemented military discipline with personal incentives for mutual care and protection. The management of rumours and information became crucial for maintaining morale during winter campaigns when communication with the outside world was limited. Veterans learned to control the spread of negative news while encouraging positive information, understanding that hope and despair could spread through units, like contagious diseases. Official news, when it came, was often carefully filtered and presented to maximise its positive psychological impact. Victory reports were emphasised and celebrated, while defeats were minimised or explained in ways that maintained confidence. Letters from home were shared selectively, with good news spread widely, while personal tragedies were kept private to avoid damaging overall morale. The creation of positive rumours, while dishonest, sometimes served important psychological functions. Stories of relief supplies on the way, reports of enemy difficulties, rumours of early spring weather, even obviously false tales of miraculous interventions, could provide hope that helped men endure when factual information offered little comfort. The celebration of holidays and special occasions took on exaggerated importance during winter campaigns, as soldiers desperately sought reasons for joy and community celebration. Religious festivals, birthdays, the anniversaries of military victories, even invented celebrations could provide breaks in the monotony of survival that renewed spirits and reinforced social bonds. These celebrations were often pathetic by peacetime standards, marked by meagre shared rations and crude entertainment rather than elaborate feasts and formal ceremonies. But their psychological impact was enormous, providing memories of joy and community that could sustain soldiers through subsequent hardships. Veterans understood that the effort invested in maintaining these traditions was essential for long-term survival. The creation of new traditions specific to winter campaigns helped build unit identity and pride that could sustain morale through the worst conditions. Initiation rituals for soldiers experiencing their first winter campaign, special recognition for survival milestones, unit-specific celebrations of minor victories over the elements. These customs created shared experiences that bonded soldiers together in exclusive brotherhoods of survival. The management of time became a psychological challenge as the endless dark days of winter campaigns seemed to stretch without meaning or progression. Veterans learned to create artificial markers of time passage, counting days until imagined relief, celebrating arbitrary milestones, maintaining calendars and schedules that provided structure and forward momentum even when actual progress was impossible. The anticipation of spring became a powerful psychological tool that could sustain hope through the darkest periods of winter campaigns. Veterans learned to identify and celebrate the earliest signs of seasonal change, no matter how subtle. The slight lengthening of days, the barely perceptible warming of afternoon sun, the first tentative bird calls all became major events that renewed hope and provided evidence that survival was possible. Planning for post-winter activities gave soldiers goals that extended beyond mere survival, providing motivation for enduring current hardships. Discussions of spring campaigns, dreams of returning home, plans for using accumulated pay, fantasies of warm weather and abundant food. These forward-looking conversations helped maintain psychological orientation toward a future beyond the immediate struggle for survival. The preservation of personal identity became a constant struggle during winter campaigns when the demands of survival could strip away everything that made individuals unique. Veterans understood that maintaining sense of self was as important as maintaining physical health, and they developed techniques for preserving personality and individuality despite the homogenizing effects of shared hardship. Personal possessions took on exaggerated importance as symbols of individual identity and connections to life beyond the military campaign. Letters from home, religious items, lucky charms, tools from civilian trades, even simple personal preferences in food or clothing became precious markers of selfhood that had to be protected and maintained despite practical pressures to abandon everything not essential for survival. The sharing of personal histories became a way of maintaining individual identity while building social connections. Soldiers told stories of their civilian lives, their families, their homes, their dreams and ambitions, creating complex portraits of themselves as complete human beings rather than just military units. These personal narratives helped maintain psychological complexity and individual worth during circumstances that reduced existence to basic survival needs. The development of nicknames and personal recognition within military units provided social identity that supplemented official military rank and designation. These informal names, often based on personality traits, skills, or memorable incidents, created personal identity within the group while building social bonds based on individual characteristics rather than just shared hardship. The maintenance of personal standards and values became a form of psychological resistance against the dehumanizing effects of extreme hardship. Soldiers who maintained ethical principles, personal cleanliness standards, or behavioral codes despite pressure to abandon them were preserving essential aspects of their humanity that would be crucial for psychological recovery after the campaign ended. The protection of weaker or less experienced soldiers became a way for veterans to maintain their own sense of moral worth and human connection. By taking responsibility for others' survival, experienced soldiers preserved their own psychological health while building social bonds that provided mutual support. This protective behaviour created meaning and purpose beyond mere personal survival. The creation of future plans and long-term goals provided psychological anchors that could sustain hope during the worst periods of winter campaigns. Veterans encouraged soldiers to make detailed plans for their lives after the campaign, to set specific goals for skills they would learn or achievements they would pursue, to maintain connection with futures that extended beyond the immediate struggle for survival. These plans might seem unrealistic given current circumstances, but their psychological value was enormous. The act of planning required soldiers to envision themselves surviving and thriving, to maintain hope and forward-looking orientation that could sustain them through periods when mere survival seemed impossible. Veterans understood that soldiers who couldn't imagine futures for themselves were unlikely to fight hard enough to reach those futures. The legacy of these psychological survival techniques extended far beyond individual winter campaigns, creating a body of knowledge about human resilience that was passed down through generations of soldiers. Each campaign added new understanding about the mental challenges of extreme hardship and the techniques that could help humans endure conditions that seem designed to break them. Modern military psychology has validated many of the intuitive techniques developed by medieval soldiers, confirming that their crude but effective methods for maintaining morale and mental health were based on sound psychological principles. The emphasis on social support, meaningful activity, forward-looking orientation, and preservation of individual identity remains central to contemporary understanding of psychological survival in extreme conditions. The bonds formed between soldiers during winter campaigns often lasted lifetimes, creating relationships that transcended normal social boundaries and provided ongoing psychological support long after the immediate survival crisis had passed. These connections became part of the healing process, helping veterans process traumatic experiences while maintaining the sense of brotherhood that had sustained them through their ordeals. The knowledge that others had survived similar ordeals provided hope and inspiration for soldiers facing their own winter campaigns. Stories of previous survivals, legends of units that had endured impossible conditions, examples of individual soldiers who had overcome seemingly fatal circumstances, all became part of the psychological arsenal that helped men believe that survival was possible even in the darkest moments. But perhaps most importantly, these medieval soldiers proved that the human capacity for adaptation and mutual support could triumph over conditions that seemed designed to destroy both body and spirit. They demonstrated that survival wasn't just about having the right equipment or perfect conditions, but about the willingness to care for others, to maintain hope when everything seemed hopeless, and to preserve humanity in the face of dehumanizing circumstances. Their techniques were crude by modern standards, their understanding limited by the knowledge of their time, their resources pathetic compared to contemporary military capabilities. Yet they accomplished something remarkable, proving that the human spirit, like the carefully tended embers of a winter fire, could be kept alive through even the longest, darkest nights of despair and hardship. In the end, these medieval soldiers discovered that winter warfare demanded a complete transformation of how armies functioned. The neat formations and organised supply lines of summer campaigns dissolved into something more primal, more desperate, more human. Units that survived did so not because of superior equipment or brilliant strategy, but because they learned to become families bound together by the shared understanding that tomorrow's survival depended on today's cooperation. The veterans who emerged from these frozen campaigns carried scars that went deeper than any sword wound. Missing fingers and toes were visible reminders, but the invisible marks ran through their souls. They had learned truths about human endurance that couldn't be taught in any training ground, lessons written in frost and hunger, and the memory of comrades who simply didn't wake up one morning when the cold grew too bitter to fight. These men understood something that modern soldiers, for all their technological advantages, rarely experience. They knew what it meant to depend completely on the person sleeping next to them, to share not just food and warmth, but the very breath that kept them alive. They had felt the weight of another man's life in their hands, when hypothermia turned a strong warrior into a shivering child who needed to be fed and warmed and reminded to keep breathing. The transformation of personality during these campaigns was profound and often permanent. Men who had been selfish or cruel discovered reserves of compassion they never knew existed. Soldiers who had seemed weak or cowardly found strength they didn't know they possessed when their comrades' lives depended on their actions. The extreme conditions stripped away pretense and revealed the essential character beneath, sometimes with results that surprised everyone, including the men themselves. Leadership during winter campaigns required qualities that weren't mentioned in any manual of arms. The ability to judge when a soldier was approaching his breaking point, when to push forward, and when rest was more important than progress, how to distribute scarce resources fairly while maintaining the authority necessary for military discipline. Officers learned to lead not just with commands but with example, sharing the worst hardships while maintaining the confidence their men needed to believe survival was possible. The most effective leaders were often those who understood that their primary enemy wasn't the opposing army, but despair itself. They became experts in reading the subtle signs that preceded unit breakdown, the gradual loss of hope that could spread through a company faster than any disease. They learned to intervene before despair took hold, using techniques that ranged from practical problem solving to crude but effective psychology. Some officers discovered they had talents they never suspected, becoming storytellers or musicians or simply sources of steady calm in chaotic situations. Others found that their peacetime leadership skills were useless in winter conditions and had to completely reinvent their approach to command. The campaigns became testing grounds, not just for physical endurance but for every aspect of military leadership. The relationship between officers and common soldiers evolved during winter campaigns in ways that would have been impossible under normal conditions. Shared hardship created bonds that transcended military hierarchy. Though experienced leaders learned to maintain necessary discipline while acknowledging the special circumstances. Some officers found themselves learning survival techniques from veteran sergeants who had more experience with extreme conditions. The breakdown of normal military protocol wasn't necessarily harmful if it was managed carefully. Flexibility in command structure could save lives when rigid adherence to peacetime rules would have been fatal. The best units developed informal systems that maintained military effectiveness while adapting to the unique demands of winter survival. Communication between different levels of command became more crucial and more difficult during winter campaigns. Orders that made sense in comfortable headquarters might be impossible to execute in frozen field conditions. Feedback from frontline units became essential for commanders who needed to understand the reality of conditions their soldiers were facing. The logistics of winter campaigns challenged every assumption about military supply and organisation. Normal calculations about food, fuel, and equipment consumption became meaningless when survival demanded resources far beyond peacetime standards. Supply officers learned to plan for waste and inefficiency that would be unacceptable under normal circumstances, but were inevitable when every activity required more energy and materials to accomplish. Transportation systems that worked efficiently in good weather often failed completely under winter conditions. Roads became impassable, animals died from exposure, vehicles broke down in ways that couldn't be repaired. With available tools and materials, armies learned to carry everything they needed or go without, understanding that resupply might be impossible for weeks or months at a time. The preservation of equipment became as important as its initial acquisition. Weapons that worked perfectly in temperate conditions could become useless in extreme cold. Metal became brittle, leather cracked, wood warped and split. Soldiers learned to baby their equipment like precious children, understanding that a broken sword or damaged armour could mean death not from enemy action, but from inability to defend themselves. Repair and maintenance skills became as valuable as fighting ability during winter campaigns. Soldiers who could fix broken equipment, patch damaged clothing, or jury-rig solutions to unexpected problems became essential members of their units. These practical skills often mattered more than traditional military training when survival depended on keeping minimal equipment functional under impossible conditions. The development of new tools and techniques happened constantly during winter campaigns as soldiers adapted to challenges they had never anticipated. Improvised solutions to heating problems, innovative shelter designs, new methods for processing food or preserving equipment. These innovations were born of necessity and refined through trial and error that could be literally fatal if the experiments failed. Some of these battlefield innovations were so effective that they were adopted by subsequent armies and became standard military practice. Others were too specific to winter conditions or too dependent on particular circumstances to have broader application, but all represented the triumph of human creativity over seemingly impossible challenges. The knowledge gained during winter campaigns was preserved not in official manuals, but in the oral traditions passed down from veteran to recruit. These informal educational systems were often more valuable than formal military training because they addressed real problems with practical solutions developed under actual field conditions. The stories told around winter campfires weren't just entertainment, but educational tools that transmitted survival knowledge in memorable forms. Tales of soldiers who had overcome particular challenges, accounts of successful techniques for dealing with specific problems, warnings about mistakes that had proven fatal, all became part of a curriculum that no military academy could match. Veterans became living libraries of survival knowledge, their value to military units extending far beyond their combat skills. A sergeant who had survived multiple winter campaigns was worth his weight in gold, not just for his fighting ability, but for his understanding of how to keep soldiers alive under conditions that killed inexperienced troops with terrifying efficiency. The respect accorded to winter campaign veterans was different from the honour given to heroes of famous battles. These men were survivors rather than conquerors. Their achievement measured not in enemies defeated but in mornings awakened, in comrades saved, in the simple fact of continued existence when everything conspired against life itself. The psychological impact of surviving winter campaigns created a special brotherhood among veterans that lasted for life. Men who had shared these experiences understood each other in ways that couldn't be explained to those who hadn't faced similar trials. They had been tested in ways that revealed their essential character and found themselves capable of endurance they never knew they possessed. These bonds often proved stronger than family relationships or civilian friendships because they were forged in circumstances where pretense was impossible and mutual dependence was complete. Veterans would travel great distances to attend the funerals of men they had served with, understanding that these relationships transcended ordinary social connections. The reunion gatherings of winter campaign survivors became legendary events where old soldiers would share memories and techniques, passing down knowledge to younger men who might face similar challenges. These informal gatherings served educational purposes that complemented official military training, providing practical wisdom that couldn't be learned from books or lectures. The stories shared at these reunions became part of military folklore, tales of impossible survival and heroic endurance that inspired subsequent generations of soldiers. Some of these stories grew in the telling, becoming legends that bore little resemblance to historical fact but served important psychological purposes in maintaining military morale and tradition. The medical knowledge developed during winter campaigns often advanced the broader understanding of cold weather injuries and survival techniques. Military surgeons learned to treat conditions they had never encountered in peacetime practice, developing techniques that sometimes found application in civilian medicine. The psychological insights gained from winter campaigns contributed to a growing understanding of human resilience and the factors that determined who survived extreme stress and who didn't. These observations wouldn't be formalized into scientific study for centuries, but the practical knowledge was preserved in military tradition and applied to subsequent training and operations. The economic impact of winter campaigns extended far beyond their immediate military costs. The specialized equipment, increased rations, and medical care required for winter operations significantly increased the expense of military campaigns. Some wars were won or lost based on which side could better afford the costs of winter warfare. The social consequences of winter campaigns affected entire societies as disabled veterans returned home, requiring long-term care and support. Communities learned to recognize and accommodate soldiers who had been changed by their experiences, understanding that these men had sacrificed more than just their time in military service. The families of winter campaign veterans often struggled to understand and relate to men who had been profoundly changed by their experiences. Wives and children had to learn to live with soldiers who might wake screaming from nightmares, who hoarded food compulsively, who couldn't bear to be warm and comfortable without feeling guilty about comrades who had died in the cold. The civilian population's understanding of military service was deepened by contact with winter campaign veterans whose experiences went far beyond the romanticized tales of glorious battle. These men carried stories of endurance and sacrifice that revealed the true cost of warfare in terms of human suffering and resilience. The technological development stimulated by winter warfare challenges led to innovations in clothing, shelter, heating, and food preservation that eventually found civilian applications. Military necessity drove advances in materials science, engineering, and logistics that benefited broader society. The organizational lessons learned during winter campaigns influenced military structure and training long after the specific challenges had been overcome by technological advances. The understanding of small unit cohesion, leadership under stress, and resource management developed during these campaigns became part of military doctrine that persisted for centuries. The legacy of medieval winter warfare extends into modern military practice through the recognition that technology alone cannot overcome the fundamental challenges of operating in extreme conditions. Contemporary armies still study the lessons learned by soldiers who faced winter with nothing but wool, iron, and determination, understanding that human factors remain crucial regardless of technological advantages. The example set by these forgotten soldiers continues to inspire military units facing their own extreme challenges, proving that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when their survival and the lives of their comrades depend on their actions. Their legacy isn't preserved in monuments or history books, but in the living tradition of military service that values courage, sacrifice, and mutual support above personal comfort or safety. In the end, the medieval soldiers who survived winter campaigns proved something fundamental about human nature that remains true regardless of historical period or technological advancement. They demonstrated that the capacity for endurance, adaptation, and mutual care could triumph over conditions designed to destroy both body and spirit. They showed that survival isn't just about individual strength, but about the willingness to preserve humanity and compassion, even in circumstances that seem to reward only ruthless selfishness. Their crude techniques and desperate expedients may seem primitive compared to modern survival methods, but their understanding of what it takes to keep people alive under impossible conditions remains profoundly relevant. They knew that survival was ultimately a social activity, that individuals perished while communities endured, that the preservation of hope and human dignity was as important as the maintenance of body heat and nutrition. As we settle into our comfortable beds tonight, surrounded by central heating and electric lights, perhaps we can appreciate not just how far civilization has advanced, but how much we can still learn from those who came before us. These medieval soldiers, forgotten by history except as statistics in campaign records, faced the worst that nature could offer and found ways not just to survive, but to preserve their humanity in the process. They remind us that the human spirit, properly tended and shared with others, can burn steady and bright even through the longest, darkest nights of despair and hardship. Their legacy lives on in every act of sacrifice for others, every moment of hope maintained against impossible odds, every choice to preserve compassion and dignity when it would be easier to abandon them. They were ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet challenges that would test the limits of human endurance. They proved that heroism isn't always dramatic or glorious, that sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in enemies defeated, but in friends kept alive, in hope preserved, in the simple triumph of seeing another dawn break over a frozen world that tried its best to claim them in the darkness. Their fires have long since burned to cold ash, their voices fallen silent, their names forgotten by history, but their example endures a testament to the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit when faced with the ultimate test of survival. They sleep now in warm earth, having earned their rest through months of bitter cold and desperate endurance. Their legacy written not in stone, but in the continuing story of human courage and compassion that they helped author with their own frozen breath and determined hearts. Tonight, as we drift towards sleep, we carry with us the echoes of those forgotten voices, those medieval soldiers whose breath once misted in air so cold it could crack stone. They have shown us something profound about the human condition, something that transcends the centuries between their frozen camps and our warm bedrooms. These men discovered that winter warfare wasn't really about fighting the enemy across the field. It was about fighting the enemy within, the voice that whispered surrender when fingers turned black with frostbite, the despair that crept in during the darkest hours before dawn when hope seemed as distant as spring itself. They learned that the most dangerous battles were fought not with sword and shield, but with determination and the simple refusal to let the cold claim another victory. Their greatest weapon wasn't forged in any smithy. It was the understanding that no one survives alone. In a world where individual strength meant everything, these soldiers discovered that collective endurance meant more. They learned to read the signs of a comrade approaching his breaking point, to share warmth before being asked, to keep talking when silence meant surrender to the creeping numbness that preceded death. The lessons they taught each other around dying fires weren't recorded in any military manual. How to recognize when hypothermia was stealing a man's judgment, making him feel warm just before the final cold claimed him. How to rotate sleeping positions so everyone got time in the precious center of their human pile. How to tell the difference between the wind that would pass by morning and the storm that meant 3 days of huddling in whatever shelter they could scrape together. They became experts in the mathematics of survival, calculating how long their fuel would last. How to divide rations so everyone had enough to keep fighting, but no one had enough to feel satisfied. They learned to read weather in the behaviour of their breath, in the way smoke rose from fires, in the particular quality of silence that preceded the worst storms. But perhaps their greatest discovery was that dignity could survive, even when everything else was stripped away. Men who had been reduced to shivering animals still found ways to maintain their humanity, sharing the last of their food with someone weaker, taking extra watch duty so an exhausted comrade could rest, keeping alive the rituals and customs that reminded them who they were beneath the layers of desperation and grime. They understood instinctively what modern psychology has confirmed, that meaning matters more than comfort. That purpose can sustain life when pleasure cannot. A soldier who believed his suffering served something larger than himself could endure conditions that broke men who saw only personal misery in their circumstances. The bonds forged in those winter camps lasted lifetimes because they were tested in ways that revealed the deepest truths about human character. When survival depends entirely on the person next to you, when sharing your warmth might save a life, and hoarding it might doom one, pretense becomes impossible. These men learned to love each other with a fierce, protective intensity that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the recognition that they were all pieces of the same fragile flame struggling against the darkness. As we close our eyes tonight, surrounded by warmth and comfort they could never have imagined, we can honour their memory not with pity, but with gratitude for the lesson they left us. They proved that the human spirit, properly tended and shared generously, can burn bright even in the coldest darkness. They showed us that survival isn't really about having the best equipment or the most resources, but about the willingness to care for others when caring requires sacrifice. Their legacy whispers to us across the centuries, a reminder that we carry within ourselves the same capacity for endurance, the same potential for courage, the same ability to find light in the darkest circumstances. They faced winter armed with nothing but wool and iron, and the unshakable belief that morning would come again. And it always did, because they made sure it did. Breath by frozen breath, heartbeat by determined heartbeat, keeping the flame alive until the sun rose on another day of impossible survival. Sleep well tonight, knowing that somewhere in the darkness of history their watch continues, their example endures, and their quiet heroism lives on in every act of courage, every moment of hope maintained against the odds, every choice to preserve compassion when the world seems designed to freeze it solid. They remind us that even in winter's deepest cold, the human heart can remain warm, and that warmth, once kindled and carefully shared, can light the way through any darkness toward the promise of spring. And so we come to the end of our journey through the frozen campaigns of medieval warfare, where ordinary men accomplished extraordinary things, armed with nothing more than determination and the understanding that survival meant caring for each other when caring required everything they had to give. These forgotten soldiers have shown us something timeless about human resilience. They proved that the greatest victories aren't always won on battlefields marked by glory and fanfare. but in the quiet moments when someone chooses to share their last piece of bread, to give up their place by the fire, to stay awake through the coldest hours, checking on comrades who might not wake up otherwise. They discovered that heroism often looks like nothing more than refusing to give up when giving up would be so much easier. Tonight, as you settle into your warm beds surrounded by all the comforts these medieval warriors could never have dreamed of, perhaps you'll carry with you their most important lesson, that the human spirit, when properly tended and generously shared, can burn bright through even the longest, darkest nights. They faced winter with wool and iron and stubborn hope, proving that sometimes the simplest tools, wielded with courage and compassion, are more powerful than any technology. Their fires burned out centuries ago, but their example still warms us. Sleep well, knowing that in the coldest moments of life, we all carry within us the same spark that kept those medieval soldiers alive through impossible winters. And like them, we survive not by fighting the darkness alone, but by sharing our light with others until morning comes again.